and you're going to have to create a file, a blank database. And remember, the first thing you got to do is create a blank one. And you got to give it a name and my email name. Some people are chatting. Oh, Canvas says Tuesday night. I'm sorry, it's due Tuesday night. You're right, my fault. So I'm going to just go through it. My fault. You're right. I'm going to go through it and do that. Here we go. So I'm going to start a blank database, and I've got it there. And so I'm going to say external data, just like you did in Excel, and new data source from a file. And I'm going to say Excel. And I'm going to go find that file, my homework file that each of you downloaded. Remember, each of you has your own file. Let me go to homework. I'm going to go to homework 2, I guess. And here we go. So I'm going to import this file. Now on that file, I just want to show you something here real quick. I'm just going to open it real quick in Excel here. What do you mean you couldn't find that file? It's there. Browse. I should have had this up for you guys. Homework 2. Okay, so there we go. So one of the things we're going to notice in this homework is we have all this header information, and we're going to see that we have here our last name and our first name here, because that's, remember, a well-formed list. You just remember that it can't start with the same name. So essentially what we have is 2 kind of data groups. We have this data group that I'm going to do in yellow here, all right? And then what we have is this data group that I'm going to do here. And notice that they overlap, because if we're going to overlap those 2, in other words, if I were to cut or hide these 2 fields out, I'm going to just hide them, and I were to say to you, who is rep 5? Well, then you can go to the rep table, and I'll unhide it and say, oh, rep 5 is Tim Roberts. So when we import this data, what we're going to find is that we need to have a common field between the 2. We're going to import the whole thing at once. Then we're going to make the blue section its own table, and then we're going to make the orange section reflect the fields in orange. So, and the other thing I'm going to tell you is this customer ID is unique, so it will be a primary key. So here we go. We're going to import this data, all right? And first row contains column headings. We've seen this question before, and that's yes. Notice my customer ID here. All right, the next thing we want to do is we want to make the customer ID, we can tell it what type of data. We talked about that in class 9. We want to just make that an integer, and I would go ahead and take rep ID and make it an integer also. Okay, so we see that. Then we're going to choose our own primary key, and we're going to pick customer ID here. And then we're going to make the customers table. So now that we have that, we see this customers table here, and we see it looks just like our data in here, but we see we have this problem of this data should be in a whole nother table. So we're going to come over here, we're going to say create in a query design. We're going to pick the customer table, and we're going to pick the rep ID, our last name, and our first name. All right. We're going to finish that query and see that. But what I want to do is I want to come over here and say, you know, the our last name really should be last name, because in another table I won't need to split it out. So I'm going to say last. And I'm going to come over here and say first name. Okay. And then I have rep ID. So when I run the query, it should look like this. Now we want a distinct list of customers. I mean reps, not all that. We don't. In other words, we don't want 200 like we have 200 customers. We just want 200 reps. Okay. So what I'm going to do over here is there's a couple of ways to do it. I can right mouse click and say under this over here and say property sheet. I can come over here and say unique records is yes, or I could come up here and hit this totals and group by. Either way, you're going to see that I have 6 reps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now go from that select to a make table, and I'm going to call that reps. All right. Now, when I execute this, you're going to see a new table called reps. So run that, and it says you're about to paste 6 new rows in the table. Well, that's 6 rows is not much data, but if it was 60 million rows, you'd like that little warning button to say, that's a lot of stuff. I'm going to say yes there. And so I'm going to close this query now. So what you see is we now see reps and customers. Now, because we have this information in the rep table here, we no longer need it in the customer table, right? So here's what I see students do and have a problem is they'll come over here and they can highlight these two and they can come home and they can cut them or delete them. Now, if you drop the rep number too, if you drop the rep number, that's going to be a problem. So just make sure you drop the 2 last names and we can cut it here. We can say yes, okay? And now I can save that change. And now I see the customers table does not have the rep information, but I know that I could go to rep number 5 in the rep table. Rep number 5 is Tim Roberts. So far so good. We built 2 tables and they're referentially in good shape, but now we want to link them. So what we're going to come over here is we're going to hit database tools and relationships. And I'm going to drag the reps table on here and the customer table on here. Now, one of the problems before we do that is we need to make this a primary key. Everybody see that? And we don't have it as a primary key right now. So I can come over here and design the rep table, design view. All right, and I can come over here and hit this word primary key, press that, and you'll see that a little key object shows up next to it, and I can save it. Okay, now I need to close that record. All right, and when I do, I now see a key there, and I want to make that key join to this key, foreign key rep ID there, and I'm just going to enforce referential integrity and cleaning. And so now when I save that, now look, if you save it and it says you can't do it, it may be because you didn't make this a primary key, or it may be because you have the customers in the rep table open. You cannot have any tables open when you change relationships. So I do that now. Now, when I do that, what you're going to see is when I pull up, you'll now see these little plus signs and I can drill down. All right, so I'm going to take a level set here and say, is everybody okay with that? We're going to take an Excel spreadsheet. We're going to import it. We're going to make a table called reps that has 3 columns. We're going to remove a couple of fields from the customer table, and then we're going to wire them together through that referential integrity. Now, out there in our homework also, there are lots of pictures on this homework to directions. So if I tell you to look at figure 2 or figure 3 or something, it's probably a good idea that you check that out. Let me go back to sharing here real quick. Share screen. Okay. And so sometimes I tell you to see figure 1 below. Now, figure 1 below is going to show us that we have to make this a long integer or whatever I tell you, and you have to set up primary keys and things like that. So when I tell you to look at something, this is where we link the 2 things and we enforce referential integrity. Notice the rep ID and this little guy, it has a key next to it, and we see the rep ID here, those sort of things, okay? So be really careful about looking at the figures. Now, the next thing we're going to do is you'll be able to drill down and see that if you did it right, you'll be able to hit that drill down button and you see this. Notice that I do not have the rep last name or first name anymore because I can find it up here, okay? Now, my data will differ from everybody else's data, okay? The next thing we're going to do is build a crosstab query, and let's just talk about that a second. The point of the crosstab query is to get the rep ID, the last name and first name, and get states across. So we're doing kind of like a pivot table, and then you're going to aggregate in the middle. So let's look at what's going to happen here. I'm just going to open up the spreadsheet and do that here. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to, in Microsoft Access, we're going to build like a pivot table. And so if I put the rep ID over here, I'm just going to put the rep last name here. There's their name. And if I put the state over here, then we see the unique list of states in the rep ID. And then we want to do some sort of aggregation. So let's look how we're going to do this now. Now, that was on one table, but we now have 2 tables from Microsoft Access. So we're going to have to play with that a little bit. So we're going to say create query design. We're going to do reps and customers, and you should be pretty good at this right now. We're going to say rep ID, last name, first name. All right. And then we're going to see the state. So let's talk about this a second. The last name, first name is as if we're putting in rows, and the state's we're going to put in columns. And then the next thing we need to do is talk about how are we going to get that data aggregated. Okay. And then we want to see the credit limit. So these are the 5 fields we need. Now, what you need to do at this point is hit this crosstab query. I'm just going to come over here, and it's going to ask some questions. And so this will, I'm sorry, in the crosstab section, this will be a row heading. And what do I mean by that? It's just like the row heading here. In other words, that data will go down a row. And then we also do a column heading. So let's look here a second. The last name will be a row heading. The first name will be a row heading. This will be a column heading, okay? And then this is going to be a value. But when we value it, we have to do something. We have to sum it, okay? So now when I run this query, I see that I get that data. Now, if you're having problems running this query and getting it to work, come over here and look at what we've done here, because I've told you, here are the fields, and here's the row, column, and value. And notice that that says sum also. So first parts are doing group bys, but the other thing is doing an aggregation. So think of that sum as like coming over to Excel and dragging in credit limit down here to the sum section and getting that answer. All right, so there we go. That's what we got to do. And then I think I tell you to say this as credit limit by rep by state, whatever I tell you to do, and you should be able to close that. And then I should be able to come over and open that query and see the data. All right, so that's where we are on your homework. Any questions regarding that? Anybody have any questions regarding that process? Okay. All right. So without further ado, then we'll pick up class tomorrow. It'll probably